My name is Spencer. I'm a theatrical design and production major. And this is my Keystone project, Gathering Space, a model for the Museum of the Future. So I'd like everyone to invite everyone to just take a brief moment, reflect quietly. I know some of you have coffee in hand, so hopefully all the pistons are firing, but to think about the most recent experience that you've had in a museum. So some of you might have gone on a date recently. Some of you might have gone out with a group of friends, whatever the situational context might have been, but think about the last experience that you had that you would call going to a museum. And I'd like to ask you to think about why that was a museum experience. What were you doing? Were you looking at something? Were you thinking something? Or really did it just have to do with that place being called a museum? Is that your only attributing factor to a museum? So I'd like you to carry that with you throughout the rest of the presentation today, and because we're going to challenge that a little bit. What is a museum experience, and what do we consider to be of museum? So for the sake of our conversation, though, we are going to use a common definition or understanding of museums, even though there are so many different types of them. There's natural history, there's fine art, performance art, etc. But for the sake of our conversation today, we're really going to define it as space to which you go, in which expertise is being delivered by an agency in service to the public. So that's what we're operating with today, is a very space-specific idea of museum. And why are museums important? Why are we even talking about museums today? Well, museums are the most trusted sources of information for the American public. And that's a recent statistic, but that is a trending statistic. So that has been the case for about 2 decades now. But the people that trust museums the most are mostly white, are mostly older, they are exclusive political ideologies, and they are highly educated individuals. And so what that really tells us is not everyone feels as though they belong at museums, that they can trust museums. And that's important, and that's worrisome, and we need to look at that and fix that. So that brings me to my project. So I carried out this project over a year and a half, over 3 distinct phases. The first phase was a place-based investigation. The second phase was a design intervention. And the third phase, which is still ongoing, was a reflective treatise on the first 2. So to begin, phase 1, it was about critiquing our museums, and I did this really while abroad, so most of these institutions were of an international context, but I conducted over 40 visits, things like the Royal Museums Greenwich, Smithsonian Institution, etc. And throughout all of these visits, I was really looking at their exhibition spaces. A great example is the National Maritime Museum of the United Kingdom. Of course, as you can imagine, has some incredibly important narratives to be telling, but they're hard things to discuss. And they did so in a very problematic way. They used very oblique language to talk about slavery. They used the word migration to discuss that. So there are issues that they're working with, but that's embodied in their exhibition space. How they talk about things and how they present things represents who they care about and who they think about as an institution and who they're catering to. So that's a great example. But exhibitions, more broadly, they encompass so many issues and so many components of our institutions. So when you're looking at content right here, narratives and objects, that's really telling us as a visitor who they care about. And what resources they think are important. And that's also about experience. Can you operate as someone maybe with a disability in an exhibit? And are there assistive devices? Is there other vehicles for people with different learning preferences in those exhibits? And if they're not, that says also a lot about an institution and its priorities. So from those visits, I really was able to pull away 3 major issues that are embodied in our exhibitions. And they are accessibility, engagement, and experience. And not to be blunt, but museums are hard to get to, right? And they're hard to navigate in. Engagement, museums don't really often have inclusive narratives, and museums are incredibly boring for a lot of people. And so we wanted to look at how can we fix this, ultimately to make the museum better. If there's anything that you take away today, it is this, it is what's on this slide. It's designers provide people the opportunity to engage. That is the thing that I was operating off of in my second phase, challenging our museums, but really it's anybody. Accountants, consultants, teachers, we all have the ability to provide people the opportunity to engage with whatever it is. If that is a lesson, if that's an idea, if that's an experience. And so I said about, well, I want to create an exhibition. I want to create an exhibition that addresses some of these issues, accessibility, engagement, and experience. And I had these big, grand ideas. And I wanted to do something that was really focused in the area of gathering, because that's what museums are. At their core, we go and gather, right? There's a lot of people of a lot of different backgrounds, and that's where we're able to learn the most. So I wanted to create something that was around gathering, accessible, so maybe in a public square that was exciting, maybe something a little bit novel and engaging, had an inclusive narrative. And so on the screen, you can see a bit of a rendering of an exhibit that would have hopefully taken place where we used a tangible object in a case there. But then that matured. I decided to do something a little bit untraditional and used an augmented reality platform to mobilize some of the same methodologies of traditional exhibition design. So we're talking about objects, we're talking about interpretive panels, things like that, but updated them a little bit. We didn't use the word migration, we used the word slavery. And in this context, that was not the topic being discussed, but we were very accurate in what we were talking about and very truthful in the story that we were telling. And that story was about the LGBTQI community here at Boston University. We were one of the first universities to formally recognize queer organizations. And that acceptance and that institutional support has not been replicated historically in more recent years. And so I wanted to reflect on that. Why is that the case? And where can we find more belonging and foster that belonging through this exhibition? So that was the main objective and there. And so you can see here the poster, and this is just a live capture there, screen capture of the augmented reality exhibition. So it was all placed in space in Marsh Plaza and in the George Sherman Union Plaza here on Boston University Charles River campus. And there you can see some of the interpretive panels with those objects discussing these narratives of people who organized and what they were able to achieve in the ongoing work that's happening. So it wasn't perfect. I engaged with people who viewed the experience and asked them, what did you think? Do you think this was of a museum? Do you want your museums to be like this? Do we think we should ultimately change museums? And the feedback was mixed. Some people, well, yes, we should have these satellite exhibitions that are removed from the museum, that are really more intimate in our community, where people feel as though they belong, where people already come to gather and the museum is coming to them. And other people are like, no, I like the going to the museum. I like the architecture. I like that experience. And so there wasn't a clear delineation, right? We want something to change. And it was really interesting feedback. And it wasn't perfect in itself. It wasn't very accessible. It was hard for people to use the technology. And a lot of folks really loved the augmented reality technology component of it. But then, because that was so novel, maybe weren't as focused on the material that was being exhibited. So it wasn't a perfect exercise, but that really kind of demonstrates the nature of exhibition design. So that brings me to phase 3. So I've been reflecting on the process, of course, that I undertook as a designer to create an exhibition, but also the site, the place-based investigations that I made into existing exhibitions at our major museums, and wanted to investigate the prevalence of satellite campuses, so museums that have multiple campuses, traveling exhibitions, permanent exhibition methodologies, and exhibition design firms. Who are making these exhibits? What are the nature of a satellite exhibit now? And ultimately, with all that being said, how can we find an in-between? Maybe it's not an augmented reality, but maybe it's something that we haven't done yet, where it's more accessible to people, a little bit more exciting, and a little less boring. And so that brings me to the conclusion of this project, which was 2 really big things. Is that if museums look at what they want to do and what they want to change is embodied in their exhibitions, that means experience, engagement, and accessibility, then maybe that's how they're made better. And furthermore, if they look at accessibility, experience, and engagement as in their exhibitions, and they decide to move those exhibitions beyond their walls, then maybe they have a place in our future. So I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Carrie Preston, the History Project Boston, which is an archive that focuses on documenting queer history here in Boston, and a number of other lovely folks, including professors and administrators who have been able to support me in this project. Thank you. If anyone has any questions?
Thank you. That was fascinating, Spencer. And I have a question about boredom, which I think is paradoxically really intriguing. So I teach theater and performance art, and often an argument I make to students is that your sense of what is boring or interesting can change, and you can cultivate an ability to attend to things that might initially seem boring, like a static piece of artwork. And I'm curious what you think museums can do, or if they can do anything, not just to keep viewers interested, but to help us change or evolve what we think is boring or engaging.
That's a wonderful question. And I don't know. I think it's, for me, in the reflective process for as a designer looking at exhibition methodologies, what I was interested to see is what many institutions might have labeled as exciting was a updated version of the same thing. So looking at a panel was just on a screen. And maybe some museums have decided they're going to put accessibility components in those screens, right? So speech-to-text features. They might also do a personalized experience. There's museums that will use RFID technology in your ticket and attach a certain preference and content. So when you approach that screen, you have a more personalized experience. And that's maybe a little bit more exciting, right? You've taken what is a traditional idea of I'm going to look at a wall and it's going to say something to be a little bit more intimate, but also a little bit more novel. And in that way, I thought maybe that's what excitement is what we expect of museum being changed and challenged. And so I think that's what I've termed as less boring and exciting. But I don't know. I don't know if there's a translation between, right, if you go in a museum, that museum's gonna say, well, this is an exciting thing and this is a boring thing. But I did definitely reflect on that in the process and was interested in that kind of intersection of technology and where it's updating something that still isn't exciting or changing something to make it more exciting. I don't know if that answers your question, but I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really wonderful. So I guess you cited, I think, the 2018 survey that like museums are the most trusted institution, and I'm wondering, what is your opinion on museums essentially staging the intervention that you stage as a trusted institution and trying to like extend an olive branch to communities that they haven't traditionally reached out to? Or do you think that there's more strength in doing like autonomous individual interventions as you did? And can you speak more about that difference?
Thank you for your question. I think that a huge component of maybe the trust that many folks that we've talked about place in institutions is a result of their perceived expertise, their power, and their history. White, educated, politically exclusive individuals might trust a museum more because that's the name that's attached to that exhibit, or trust the information more because that's the name that's attached with that exhibit. So I think, right, even though this might be a powerful demonstration of what museum could do, and this is, if communities came together and did this, and History Project Boston has done something similar to this, and the same idea is putting the information in place, linking it, and saying, well, you don't have to come to our archive. We're going to bring everything that we could possibly do to you. I think that says a lot more about care of that institution, right? So if institutions want to express care for those communities that they're not serving because they're perceived to not care about them, they have to go to them, and they have to put exhibition in place, say, we're going to come to you so that ultimately that you can also come to us. I think that's incredibly important. Thank you for that question. And so I've reached my time, so that's all the questions I can take. I'm happy to speak afterwards. And we'll be introducing the next presenter.